She was a Cherokee pregnant widow running from bounty hunters who wanted her dead for a crime. She didn't commit until a lonely lumberjack, with blood on his hands and guilt in his heart, became the only thing standing between her and a noose. What happened next in the depths of the Oregon wilderness would test everything both of them believed about justice, redemption, and the price of protecting someone when the whole world wants them gone.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning mist clung to the ancient pines, like the breath of sleeping spirits. But Ayanna Thornbird wasn't thinking about Cherokee legends as she pressed deeper into the Oregon wilderness. Her hand rested protectively over the swell of her belly, where her unborn child kicked restlessly, as if sensing the danger that had been hunting them for 3 weeks now. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call could mean death. She paused behind a massive Douglas fir, her breathing shallow and controlled despite the burning in her lungs. The buckskin dress that had once been beautiful now hung torn and mud-stained, her long black hair escaping from its braids in tangled strands. Her moccasins, crafted by her grandmother's careful hands, were wearing thin from endless miles over rocky ground. But it was her eyes that told the real story. Dark brown orbs that had once sparkled with laughter now held the haunted wariness of a hunted animal. Behind her, perhaps a mile back through the timber, she could hear them. The bounty hunters moved, like a pack of wolves, their horses crashing through underbrush, with the confidence of men who believed their prey was weakening. They were right. Ayanna had been running for so long that her body was beginning to betray her. The baby inside her was growing heavier each day, and the meager food she'd managed to forage wasn't enough to sustain them both. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 months ago, she'd been Ayanna Thornbird, beloved wife of Joseph Thornbird, living peacefully on their small ranch near the Cascade foothills. Joseph had been half Cherokee like herself, but he'd also been something else, a former Army scout who'd made enemies during his years tracking renegade bands through these same mountains. When those enemies had finally caught up with him, they'd made sure his death looked like something else entirely. Now, Ayanna was wanted for his murder. The wanted posters described her as dangerous and cunning, offering a reward of $500 for her capture dead or alive. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years, enough to make even decent folks consider betrayal. The bounty hunters pursuing her weren't decent folks. They were the kind of men who collected human lives like other people. Collected coins, and they'd been gaining ground steadily since she'd fled her burning home. A sound drifted through the trees that made her blood freeze, the distinctive whistle that bounty hunters used to communicate with each other. 2 short bursts, followed by one long note. They'd found her trail again. Ayanna forced herself to move, each step a careful calculation of speed versus stealth. The forest here was old growth, with trees so massive that 10 men holding hands couldn't encircle their trunks. Fallen logs created natural barriers and hiding places, while thick carpets of pine needles muffled footsteps. It was Cherokee country, land her people had hunted and traveled for generations before the white settlers came. She knew how to read the subtle signs, which plants were safe to eat, where to find water, how to move without leaving obvious tracks. But knowing the land and having the strength to use that knowledge were different things. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Ayanna had to stop and lean against a tree trunk as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She was 7 months along now, her body heavy and awkward in ways that made quick movement nearly impossible. The child seemed to sense her distress, shifting and turning as if trying to find a more comfortable position in her cramped womb. "Be still, little one," she whispered in Cherokee, placing both hands over her belly. "We have to keep moving." The whistling came again, closer now. 3 short bursts this time. They definitely found sign of her passage. Ayanna knew she had perhaps 10 minutes before they caught up, maybe less if they pushed their horses hard through the easier terrain ahead. She'd been heading generally northwest, following game trails and creek beds, toward the high country where the terrain would be too rough for mounted pursuit. But the northwestern slopes were also where the logging operations worked, cutting down the ancient forests to feed the lumber mills in Portland and Seattle. Logging camps meant men with guns, and men with guns might recognize her from the wanted posters. Still, it was better than certain death at the hands of the bounty hunters. Ayanna pushed herself away from the tree and continued climbing, following a narrow deer path that switched back up the mountainside. Her heart hammered with exertion, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Horses nickering, leather creaking, men's voices calling out directions to each other. The forest began to change as she climbed higher. The massive old-growth trees gave way to smaller pines and firs, with more open spaces between them. It was beautiful country, the kind of wilderness that had sheltered her people for countless generations. But beauty offered no protection from bullets, and the more open terrain would make her easier to spot. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. The steady thunk-thunk of an axe biting into wood, accompanied by the occasional crash of a falling tree. Somewhere ahead, hidden by the timber, someone was working. Ayanna hesitated. Approaching anyone was dangerous, but staying on the game trail was suicide. The bounty hunters would catch her within minutes, and in her condition, she couldn't outrun mounted men across open ground. Her only hope was to find shelter, somewhere she could hide until they passed by. The axe work was coming from a small clearing, perhaps a quarter-mile ahead. Ayanna crept closer, moving from tree to tree like a shadow. As she drew near, she could make out more details, the sound of wood being split and stacked, the occasional grunt of effort from whoever was working. There was something methodical about the rhythm, as if the person had been at this task for hours. Finally, she reached a position where she could see into the clearing without being seen. What she found there made her catch her breath. A man worked, alone in a space that had been carved from the wilderness with obvious care. Unlike the devastation of a commercial logging operation, this clearing showed signs of selective cutting trees, removed to create a workspace, while preserving the natural beauty of the area. A small, well-built cabin sat at one end of the clearing, its log walls chinked with clay and its roof covered with hand-split shingles. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a vegetable garden grew in neat rows beside the building. But it was the man himself who captured her attention. He was tall and powerfully built, with shoulders broad enough to carry the massive logs he was splitting. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore simple clothes-wool pants, a cotton shirt, and suspenders, all bearing the honest stains of hard work. There was something about the way he moved that reminded Ayanna of her husband. Not physically, this man was larger than Joseph had been, with the kind of strength that came from years of manual labor. But he had the same deliberate precision in his movements, the same careful attention to the task at hand. Unlike Joseph, he seemed completely alone in the world as she watched. The man paused in his work and straightened, one hand going to the small of his back as if it ached.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
He looked around the clearing with obvious satisfaction, taking in the neat stacks of firewood, the well-maintained cabin, the orderly garden. This was a man who took pride in his work, who built things to last. Then his head turned sharply toward the forest, and Ayana realized he'd heard something she'd missed, the distant sound of horses moving through timber. The bounty hunters were getting closer. The man's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The peaceful satisfaction vanished, replaced by the alert tension of someone who'd learned to recognize danger. He set down his axe and moved toward the cabin with quick, silent steps. When he emerged a moment later, he carried a rifle, not the simple hunting weapon she'd expected, but a military-issue Springfield that had seen serious use. This was not a man who would run from trouble. Ayana found herself at a crossroads that would define everything that followed. She could try to circle around the clearing, hoping to avoid both the lumberjack and the bounty hunters, or she could take the desperate gamble of approaching this stranger and hoping he wasn't the type to turn in a pregnant woman for blood money. The baby kicked again, and the decision was made for her. She simply didn't have the strength to keep running. Whatever this man's character, whatever his intentions, she had to take the chance. Ayana stepped out from behind the tree and into the clearing. The lumberjack spun toward her, rifle raised and ready to fire. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the open space, a pregnant Cherokee woman in torn buckskin and a bearded giant with a gun. She could see him taking in her condition, noting the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture. His finger was on the trigger, but something in his expression suggested he wouldn't shoot without provocation. "Please," Ayana said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I need help." The man's eyes flicked past her toward the forest, where the sounds of pursuit were growing steadily louder. When his gaze returned to her face, she saw something she hadn't dared hope for, not sympathy exactly, but understanding. This was a man who knew what it meant to be hunted. "How many?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emerge from deep in his chest. "5, Ayana replied. "Maybe 6. They've been following me for days." The lumberjack nodded once, as if this information confirmed something he'd already suspected. He gestured toward the cabin with his rifle. "Get inside. Stay away from the windows." "Why are you helping me?" Ayana asked, needing to understand his motivation before she trusted him with her life. The man looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Pain, regret, maybe recognition of his own past mistakes. "Because everyone deserves a chance to tell their side of the story," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to have the whole world hunting you for something you didn't do." Ayana felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It was the first kindness anyone had shown her since Joseph's death, the first hint that someone might believe her innocence. She nodded and hurried toward the cabin, moving as quickly as her condition allowed. The interior of the cabin was simple, but comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of long winter evenings and patient craftsmanship. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. Books lined one wall, an unexpected touch that suggested the lumberjack was more educated than his appearance might indicate. Ayana positioned herself beside a window where she could see out without being easily spotted. The lumberjack had resumed. His position in the center of the clearing, rifle held casually but ready. To anyone watching, he would look like a man simply taking a break from his work to enjoy the mountain air. The bounty hunters appeared at the edge of the clearing like wolves emerging from cover. There were 5 of them, just as Ayanna had said, mounted on horses that showed the hard use of men who lived in the saddle. Their leader was a lean man with cold eyes and a mustache that had gone grey at the edges. Ayanna recognized him immediately as Blackwood, one of the most notorious manhunters in the territory. Blackwood rode into the clearing with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His 4 companions spread out behind him, forming a loose semicircle that would make escape difficult. All of them wore guns, and all of them had the weathered look of men who'd spent years living on the edge of violence. "Afternoon, Blackwood," called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake preparing to strike. "We're tracking a fugitive through these parts. Cherokee woman, pregnant, dangerous. You seen anyone like that?" The lumberjack leaned on his axe handle, the picture of casual unconcern. "Haven't seen anyone for weeks," he replied. "Don't get many visitors up here." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied the clearing, taking in the neat stacks of firewood, the well-maintained cabin, the garden showing signs of recent work. "Nice place you got here. Live alone, do you? Prefer it that way? I'll bet you do." Blackwood dismounted and walked closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Thing is, we've been tracking this woman for 3 weeks now. Lost her trail down in the timber, but our tracker says she was definitely heading this direction. Funny thing about tracks, they don't just disappear." The lumberjack straightened slightly, and Ayanna could see the subtle shift in his posture. That suggested he was preparing for violence. "Maybe your tracker isn't as good as you think." Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, he's good. Real good. Matter of fact, he's circling around behind your cabin right now, looking for sin," as if summoned by his words. A 5th man appeared at the edge of the clearing, a wiry individual with the patient eyes of someone who could read stories in disturbed earth and broken twigs. He caught Blackwood's attention and shook his head. Slightly, "No fresh tracks around the cabin," the tracker called out, "but there's definitely sign leading into this clearing." "Recent sign," Blackwood's smile widened. "Well now, that is interesting. Fresh tracks leading in, but no tracks leading out. Almost like someone just ... disappeared." The lumberjack's grip tightened on his rifle. "Maybe you boys should move along. I've got work to do." "Oh, we'll move along, all right. Soon as we search your cabin." Blackwood's hand moved closer to his gun. "See, there's a $500 reward for this woman, dead or alive. That's a lot of money, enough to make a man forget his manners if he thought someone was trying to keep him from earning it." From her hiding place, Ayanna watched the confrontation with growing dread. She'd brought danger to this stranger's doorstep, and now he was facing 5 armed men because of her. The honorable thing would be to surrender, to step outside and face whatever fate awaited her. But she thought of the child growing inside her, innocent of any crime, and knew she couldn't give up without a fight. The lumberjacks seemed to sense the moment when talk would end and violence would begin. "I said you should move along," he repeated, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Private property? Out here in the middle of nowhere? I don't think you understand how this works, friend. We go where we want, search what we want, take what we want. That's the privilege of carrying federal warrants. Federal warrants don't give you the right to trespass on a man's land without cause." "Oh, but we do have cause. We have fresh tracks, leading to your clearing and a pregnant Cherokee woman who seems to have vanished into thin air. That's what we call probable cause. Blackwood gestured to his men. Boys, I think it's time we had a look inside that cabin. The lumberjack raised his rifle in one smooth motion, the muzzle pointing directly at Blackwood's chest. I think it's time you rode out of here. The clearing erupted into tense silence. 5 men faced one, but the one held the advantage of position and preparation. Ayanna could see the calculations running through. Blackwood's mind weighing the $500 reward against the very real possibility of dying in this remote clearing. You're making a mistake, Blackwood said, his voice now stripped of all pretense. Harboring a fugitive is a federal crime. You'll hang right alongside her. Maybe, the lumberjack replied, but you'll be too dead to see it. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Ayanna held her breath, knowing that whatever happened in the next few seconds would determine whether she lived to see her child born. The baby seemed to sense the tension, kicking frantically against her ribs as if trying to escape the danger that surrounded them. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came the sound of an approaching rider hoofbeats, moving fast through the timber. All eyes turned toward the sound, and Ayanna felt her heart sink. Reinforcements for the bounty hunters would tip the odds, past any hope of survival. But the rider who emerged from the tree line wasn't wearing the dusty clothes of a manhunter. Instead, he wore the blue uniform of a territorial marshal, complete with badge and official papers. His horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting he'd ridden hard to reach this place. Marshal Collins, Blackwood said, his voice betraying surprise. What brings you up here? The marshal dismounted and walked into the clearing, his eyes taking in the tense standoff with professional assessment. Came looking for you, Blackwood. Got some news about your fugitive that changes things considerably. Blackwood frowned. What kind of news? Marshal Collins pulled out a folded paper and handed it to the bounty hunter. Telegraph came in from the territorial capital this morning. The real killer confessed. Ayanna Thornbird has been cleared of all charges. The words hit the clearing like thunder. Ayanna felt her knees go weak with relief, while Blackwood stared at the paper as if it had burst into flames. Confessed. Blackwood's voice was strangled. Who confessed? Fellow named Pike Morrison. Turns out he'd been nursing a grudge against Joseph Thornbird for years. Something about a scouting mission that went bad during the Indian Wars. He finally couldn't live with the guilt and turned himself in. The marshal looked around the clearing, his gaze settling on the cabin. Mrs. Thornbird is officially a free woman. Any of you boys seen her? The lumberjack slowly lowered his rifle, but his eyes remained fixed on Blackwood. Might have. Why don't you boys put your guns away before we discuss it further? It was over. After 3 weeks of running, 3 weeks of fear and desperation, Ayanna was finally free. She stepped out of the cabin on unsteady legs, tears streaming down her face. The marshal tipped his hat respectfully, while Blackwood and his men looked like they'd been cheated out of a fortune. Mrs. Thornbird, Marshal Collins said, I'm sorry for what you've been through. The territory will make sure you're compensated for your troubles. Ayanna nodded, but her attention was focused on the lumberjack who'd risked his life to protect her. He was watching her with those careful eyes, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip, not attraction exactly, but recognition. To people who'd been marked by tragedy, finding an unexpected moment of grace in a world that had shown them little kindness. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate, but all she had. The lumberjack nodded once, ma'am, and in that simple acknowledgement, Ayana felt the first stirring of something she thought she'd lost forever: hope for a future that might hold more than just survival. The bounty hunters rode away like vultures, denied their feast. Blackwood's face twisted with the bitter disappointment of a man who'd just watched $500 disappear into mountain air. Marshal Collins followed shortly after, offering Ayana safe passage to town and official protection. But as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the forest, Ayana found herself making a decision that surprised even her. She stayed, standing in the clearing beside the man who'd risked everything for a stranger. Ayana felt something she hadn't experienced since Joseph's death: safety, not the temporary reprieve of hidden caves or thick timber, but genuine safety radiating from someone strong enough to provide it. The lumberjack had faced down 5 armed men without hesitation, and when she thanked him, the quiet nod he'd given her carried more weight than all the marshal's official apologies. "You should go with him," the lumberjack said, nodding toward the trail where Marshal Collins had disappeared. "Town's got a doctor, proper food, a soft bed, better for ... He gestured awkwardly toward her swollen belly. Ayana placed both hands protectively over her unborn child, feeling the baby's restless movements beneath her palms. 7 months pregnant, exhausted from weeks of running, cleared of all charges, logic dictated she should accept the marshal's offer and return to civilization. But something deeper than logic was speaking now, some instinct that told her this. Clearing, this man, represented something more valuable than mere comfort. "What's your name?" she asked, instead of answering his suggestion. The man hesitated, as if the question touched on something painful. "Most folks call me Timber." "That's not your real name." "No," he admitted, "but it's the one I use now." Ayana studied his face, noting the careful way he held himself, the haunted quality in his dark eyes that reminded her of her own reflection. "You said you knew what it was like to be hunted for something you didn't do. Were you telling the truth?" Timber looked away, his gaze fixing on the neat stacks of firewood that represented months of solitary labor. "I was telling the truth about being hunted. The part about not doing anything ... He shrugged. "That's more complicated." The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Ayana knew she should be afraid, a pregnant woman, alone with a man who'd just confessed to some unnamed crime. Instead, she felt an unexpected kinship. They were both refugees from their former lives, both carrying burdens that had driven them into the wilderness. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said quietly. "My ranch burned down. My husband's family disowned me when I was accused of his murder. The Cherokee band my mother came from." She paused, remembering the shame in her uncle's eyes when the accusations first surfaced. "They believe in justice, but they also believe in avoiding trouble with white law. I'm not welcome there anymore." Timber was quiet for a long moment, his hands working absently at the leather cord that held back his hair. Finally, he looked at her directly. "You can stay," he said, "until the baby comes, anyway. After that ... He shrugged again. "We'll see." It wasn't an enthusiastic invitation, but it was honest. Ayana felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it made her dizzy. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have to plan her next hiding place, or ration her last piece of dried meat, or wonder if she'd live to see morning. "Thank you," she whispered. Timber nodded once, then turned back to his interrupted work. "There's a spare room in the cabin. Hasn't been used in ... Double quotes, he paused in a while. "You'll need to air it out, but the bed's solid." As he bent to retrieve his axe, Ayana caught sight of something that made her breath catch. Beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his work shirt, a scar ran along his forearm, not the clean line of a blade, but the puckered, twisted mark of a bullet wound. And on his left hand, she glimpsed a pale band where a wedding ring had once rested. This man had secrets as deep as her own. The spare room Timber had mentioned was small but well built, with a single window that looked out over the vegetable garden and a sturdy bed frame carved from local pine. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, and the air smelled of disuse and old memories. But the mattress was good, stuffed with what felt like fresh straw, and someone had taken care to build this space with attention to comfort. Ayana spent the afternoon making the room habitable, sweeping away cobwebs and airing out bedding that had been stored in a cedar chest. As she worked, she found small signs of the room's previous occupant: a woman's hairbrush left on the windowsill, a dried flower pressed between the pages of a book, a small mirror with a crack running down one corner. The lumberjack had been married. The pale band on his finger confirmed it, as did the careful way he'd avoided mentioning who had used this room before. Another piece of the puzzle that was Timber's past, another reason he might understand what it meant to lose everything that mattered while she worked. Ayana could hear him outside, the steady rhythm of axe against wood, the occasional grunt of effort, the crash of split logs hitting the ground. There was something almost meditative about the sounds, a purposeful routine that spoke of a man who'd found peace in physical labor, or perhaps found escape in it. As evening approached, the rhythm stopped. Ayana heard footsteps on the cabin's porch, followed by the creak of the front door opening. She emerged from the spare room to find Timber washing his hands at the kitchen basin, his shirt damp with honest sweat. "There's venison stew on the stove," he said without looking at her. "Help yourself." The stew was simple but hearty, thick with chunks of meat and root vegetables that must have come from his garden. Ayana ate hungrily, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Across from her, Timber ate in silence, his attention focused on his bowl with the concentrated intensity of a man unaccustomed to dinner conversation. "How long have you lived here?" Ayana asked, needing to fill the quiet. 3 years, Timber replied. "Built the cabin myself, cleared the garden, cut all the firewood you see out there. It's beautiful work. You're a skilled carpenter." Something flickered across Timber's face, pleasure at the compliment, perhaps, or pain at some memory it triggered. "I learned from my father. He believed in building things to last." "What did he build?" Timber set down his spoon and looked at her with those careful eyes. "Houses, barns, churches, things that made communities stronger." He paused. "I used to help him before ... double quotes, before what? Before I learned that some things can't be built strong enough to survive what men do to each other." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Ayana felt her heart go out to this man who'd clearly suffered losses as profound as her own. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had driven him to this isolated existence, but something in his expression warned her away from pushing too hard. Instead, she offered a piece of her own story. "My husband was a carpenter too, among other things. He built our ranch house with his own hands. Every board and nail planned out like he was creating something that would last forever." She smiled sadly. "He used to say that a house built with love would always protect the people inside it. What happened to it? Burned to the ground the night he was killed. I think whoever murdered him wanted to destroy any evidence that might point to the real killer." Ayana's voice grew hard. "They nearly succeeded." Timber nodded slowly, understanding the bitter irony of innocence destroyed along with evidence. You said your husband was a scout during the Indian Wars. He was. Joseph had this gift for reading sign, for understanding how different tribes moved through the country. The army used him to track renegade bands, but he never forgot he was Cherokee himself. He tried to bring people in peacefully when he could. That would make enemies on both sides, Ayanna confirmed. White settlers who thought he was too sympathetic to the tribes, and warriors who saw him as a traitor for working with the army. Joseph used to say that being a bridge between two worlds meant getting shot at from both directions. Timber's expression grew thoughtful. Pike Morrison, the man who confessed. That name sounds familiar. Ayanna looked up sharply. You knew him, not personally, but I heard the name during the wars. Morrison was a sergeant, I think, known for being hard on scout units. Lost a lot of men in an ambush somewhere up in the Cascades. Timber frowned, accessing old memories. There were rumors that the scout who led them into the trap did it deliberately, that he'd been bought off by the hostiles. Joseph never mentioned that specific incident, but he carried a lot of guilt about men who died following his advice. He used to have nightmares. Ayanna trailed off, remembering the nights her husband had awakened in cold sweats, mumbling names of soldiers who hadn't made it home. Morrison probably blamed him for whatever happened to his unit. Some men can carry a grudge for years, let it poison everything good in their lives, until all that's left is the need for revenge. The words carried a weight that made Ayanna look at Timber more closely. Was he speaking from experience? Had he carried his own poisonous grudges through these mountains until he'd found a way to lay them down? After dinner, they sat on the cabin's front porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a lonely sound that seemed to echo the isolation both of them had chosen. The baby's due in about 2 months, Ayanna said, her hands resting on her belly. I should probably be in town by then, near a doctor. Timber nodded. We'll make sure you get there when the time comes. The casual use of we sent a small warmth through Ayanna's chest. For weeks, every decision had been hers. Alone where to hide, which direction to run, how to ration her dwindling supplies. Having someone else share that burden, even temporarily, felt like a gift beyond measure. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. The woman who used that room before me, what happened to her? Timber was quiet for so long that Ayanna thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Her name was Sarah. We were married for 6 years. She died. She was killed, along with our son. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Ayanna could hear the control it took to keep them that way. 3 years ago, down in California, I was away on a job, building a church for a mining town. When I came back, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Ayanna had seen enough violence to fill in the horrible blanks. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it completely. The men who did it were never caught, never even investigated properly, because Sarah was half Mexican, and our boy looked like her family. Local sheriffs said it was probably just drifters passing through, but I knew better. Timber's hands clenched into fists. I knew exactly who did it and why. What did you do? Timber looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain and guilt. She was only beginning to understand. I hunted them down. All 4 of them, and I made sure they never hurt another family. The confession hung in the night air like smoke from a distant fire. Ayanna felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with recognition. This was why Timber understood what it meant to be hunted, why he'd been willing to face down 5 armed men. To protect a stranger, he'd crossed that line between victim and avenger, had chosen justice over law when law failed him. Did it help? She asked quietly. Getting revenge. For a while, Timber admitted. For a while, it felt like I'd balanced. The scales, like Sarah and little David, could rest easier knowing their killers were dead. But revenge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It eats you up from the inside until there's nothing left but the need for more. Is that why you came here? To get away from that feeling? I came here because I was tired of being angry all the time. Tired of seeing Sarah's face in every crowd, hearing David's laugh in every child's voice. I thought, if I could build something new, something peaceful, maybe I could find a way to live with what I'd done. Ayana studied his profile in the starlight, seeing the careful control that held his emotions in check. Have you found a way to live with it? Timber was quiet for a moment, then surprised her with a small, sad smile. Ask me again in a few weeks. Talking to someone who understands what it's like to lose everything, ... It's helping more than I expected. They sat in comfortable silence after that, 2 wounded souls finding unexpected solace in shared understanding. The baby kicked lazily in Ayana's womb, and she placed her hand over the movement, thinking about the future that was growing inside her. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited, she was no longer facing them alone. As if reading her thoughts, Timber stood and stretched. You should get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll need to start preparing for winter. It comes early up here. And if you're staying until the baby comes, we'll need extra supplies. I can work, Ayana said quickly. I'm not an invalid, just pregnant. My grandmother always said Cherokee women were strong enough to birth babies in the field and keep working. Timber's smile became more genuine. I don't doubt it. But there's a difference between being strong and being reckless. We'll find work that suits your condition. As Ayana prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a fugitive, running for her life through hostile wilderness. Now, she was sharing a cabin with a man who'd confessed to multiple murders, planning for a winter in the mountains, while carrying another man's child. By all logic, she should be terrified. Instead, as she settled into the comfortable bed in the spare room, listening to the familiar sounds of timber moving around the cabin, Ayana felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: peace. Outside her window, the mountain wind whispered through the pines like the voices of ancient spirits offering their protection. And for the first time since Joseph's death, Ayana dared to hope that she might actually have a future worth living. But peace, she would soon learn, was a fragile thing in the wilderness. And the past, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface when you least expected it. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountain peaks with white, while the lower elevations still blazed with autumn colors. Ayana had been living in Timber's clearing for 2 weeks, and they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He would work on winter preparations, while she tended the garden and preserved vegetables, both of them moving round each other with the careful courtesy of strangers learning to share space. But on the morning the snow appeared, everything changed. Ayana was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard Timber's axe stop mid-swing. The sudden silence was so complete it made her skin crawl, like the moment before lightning strikes. She turned toward the clearing and saw him standing motionless beside a half-split log. his head cocked as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Then she heard it toothed distant sound of horses moving through timber, but not the casual pace of travelers. These riders were moving with purpose, following a specific trail toward a known destination, and they were trying to be quiet about it. Timber caught her eye and jerked his head toward the cabin. Ayanna dropped the wet shirt she'd been hanging and moved quickly but quietly toward the building. Her pregnancy made her awkward, but fear gave her speed. Something about those approaching hoofbeats felt wrong, predatory in a way that made her instincts scream danger. Inside the cabin, Timber was already moving with military precision. He pulled his Springfield rifle from its rack and checked the load, then moved to a wooden chest near the fireplace. When he opened it, Ayanna saw something that made her blood run cold. Enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army. "How many?" she whispered. "4, maybe 5. Coming from the South Trail, Timber handed her a short-barreled shotgun, the kind miners used for close-quarters protection. "You know how to use this." Ayanna took the weapon, surprised by its weight. "Joseph taught me." But who would? Her question was answered before she could finish it. Through the cabin window, she caught sight of the lead rider as he emerged from the tree line, and her heart stopped. She knew that face, had seen it in her nightmares for 3 years running. It was scarred now, marked by what looked like a knife wound across the left cheek, but there was no mistaking those cold, calculating eyes. Marcus Valdez, the man who'd actually killed her husband. "Oh God," Ayanna breathed, sinking into a chair as the full horror of the situation hit her. "It's him. It's the real killer." Timber's expression hardened as he saw the recognition on her face. "The man who murdered your husband, Marcus Valdez. He was Joseph's commanding officer during the final campaigns. Joseph caught him selling army weapons to hostile tribes, threatened to report him. That's why, ... double quotes, Ayanna's voice broke. That's why he killed him and made it look like I did it." Through the window, they could see Valdez and his men spreading out around the clearing with practiced efficiency. These weren't bounty hunters looking for reward money, they were killers who'd come to eliminate the one person who could expose Valdez's crimes. The confession that had cleared Ayanna of murder charges had also revealed that someone else had committed the crime, and Valdez couldn't afford to let her live to identify him. "How did he find us?" Ayanna asked, though she already suspected. The answer, Blackwood, Timber said grimly. $500 wasn't enough to satisfy a man like that. Valdez probably offered him more to keep tracking you even after the charges were dropped. The riders had stopped just at the edge of the clearing, close enough to communicate, but far enough away to avoid rifle fire from the cabin. Valdez himself remained mounted, studying the peaceful domestic scene with the cold assessment of a professional predator. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the open space. "Thomas McKenna," he called out, using a name that made Timber freeze. "I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me." Ayanna stared at Timber in shock. "McKenna? That's your real name?" Timber's face had gone pale, but his grip on the rifle remained steady. "That's the name I used before I became Timber. Before I learned that some names carry too much weight to bear." "We need to talk, McKenna," Valdez continued. "About old times. About mutual friends who didn't live to see their pension years." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place in Ayanna's mind. Timber's military bearing, his skill with weapons, the scars on his arm, the way he'd recognized Pike Morrison's name. He hadn't just been a soldier during the Indian Wars. He'd been involved in something deeper, something that connected him to the web of corruption that had destroyed her life. "You know him," she said, and it wasn't a question. Timber nodded slowly. "I served under him, before I found out what kind of man he really was." Outside, Valdez was growing impatient. "I'm not going away, McKenna. We both know how this ends. You can make it easy on yourself and the woman, or you can make it hard. But either way, I'm walking out of here alive and she isn't." "What does he want?" Ayanna asked, though part of her already knew. "Me dead, you dead, and all witnesses to his gun-running operation eliminated." Timber moved to a different window, keeping track of the men positioning themselves around the cabin. 3 years ago, when I went after the men who killed my family, I learned things about Valdez's operation that could hang him. I thought I'd buried that information deep enough that it would never surface. But now that I'm alive and cleared of Joseph's murder, people will start asking questions about who really killed him. And those questions will eventually lead back to Valdez's illegal arms dealing. He can't afford that kind of scrutiny. Ayanna felt the baby kick frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. She placed a protective hand over her belly, thinking of the innocent life that depended on her survival. "What are our options?" Timber's smile was grim. "Fight or die. Those are the only choices Valdez ever gives people." Thomas McKenna Valdez called again. "I'm going to count to 10. If you don't come out and discuss this like civilized men, I'm going to assume you've chosen the hard way." 1. Timber checked his rifle again, then moved to a gun port he'd cleverly disguised as a decorative knot in the cabin's log wall. "Whatever happens, stay low and keep that shotgun ready. If they get inside..." 2. "I know," Ayanna said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I won't let them take me alive." 3. The count continued with methodical precision, each number bringing them closer to violence. Ayanna found herself thinking not of fear but of anger rage at the man who'd stolen her husband's life, destroyed her reputation, and now threatened her unborn child. Joseph had died trying to expose corruption in the army, and she'd spent weeks running from a crime she didn't commit. Now, finally, she had a chance to face the real enemy. 4. Through the window, she could see one of Valdez's men moving through the trees, trying to get behind the cabin. He moved well, but not well enough to fool someone who'd spent years hunting in these mountains. 5. "There's one circling around back," she whispered to Timber. "I see him. When the shooting starts, he'll probably try to come through the rear window. That's where you'll need that shotgun." 6. Ayanna positioned herself where she could cover the back of the cabin, while still having a clear view of Timber. The baby was moving constantly now, and she wondered if her child would be born into a world of violence, or if they'd both die here in this remote clearing. 7. McKenna. Valdez's voice took on a mocking tone. "You always were too sentimental for this work. That's why you never made it past sergeant. Too worried about protecting the weak to do what needed doing." 8. Timber's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond to the taunt. Ayanna could see him calculating angles and distances, preparing for a fight that would determine whether they lived or died. 9. The word hung in the mountain air like a death sentence. Ayanna took a deep breath, feeling oddly calm despite the circumstances. She thought of her grandmother's stories about Cherokee warriors who'd faced impossible odds with dignity and courage. She thought of Joseph, who'd died trying to do the right thing. And she thought of the child growing inside her, who deserved a chance to see the world. 10. The clearing erupted into chaos as Valdez's men opened fire on the cabin from 3 different positions. Bullets shattered windows and chewed chunks from the log walls. But timber had built wealther. Thick timber absorbed most of the impact, providing solid protection for the defenders inside. Timber's return fire was precise and devastating. His first shot dropped the man who'd been trying to flank them, the rifle crack echoing off the surrounding mountains like thunder. His second shot forced another attacker to dive for cover behind a fallen log, disrupting their coordinated assault. But it was Ayanna who provided the most shocking surprise of the fight. When Valdez himself tried to rush the front door, confident that a pregnant woman posed no threat, she met him with both barrels of the shotgun at point-blank range. The blast knocked him backward and sent him scrambling for cover, blood streaming from dozens of small wounds across his face and chest. "You Cherokee bitch," he screamed, his voice filled with pain and rage. "I should have killed you 3 years ago. You should have," Ayanna called back, reloading the shotgun with hands that were surprisingly steady. "But you were too much of a coward to face me directly." The admission confirmed what they'd all known but couldn't prove. Valdez had indeed murdered Joseph Thornbird and framed his wife for the crime. But confirmation and justice were different things. And justice would only come if they survived the next few minutes. The firefight continued with desperate intensity, bullets flying in both directions as each side sought advantage. Timber's military training showed in his tactical thinking. He used the cabin's construction to create overlapping fields of fire while denying his enemies clear shots. But they were outnumbered and surrounded, with limited ammunition and no possibility of retreat. That's when Ayanna remembered something. Joseph had taught her about fighting overwhelming odds. Sometimes the key to survival wasn't winning the battle, it was changing the rules of engagement. "The oil lamps," she shouted to Timber during a brief lull in the shooting. "If we can start a fire, create smoke." Timber understood immediately. He grabbed one of the kerosene lamps from the kitchen table and hurled it against the front wall, where the fuel spread across the logs and ignited in a whoosh of flame. The fire provided both concealment and distraction, forcing Valdez's men to adjust their positions. But the tactic came with a terrible cost. They'd just set their own shelter on fire. The flames spread quickly across the oil-soaked logs, filling the cabin with smoke and heat. Within minutes, they'd have to choose between burning alive and facing Valdez's guns in the open. "We can't stay here," Timber said, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "The fire's spreading too fast." Ayanna looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, seeing years of careful work being consumed by flames. But more than wood and stone was burning. She could see papers scattered on the floor, documents that might have contained evidence of Valdez's crimes. "Your evidence," she said. "The information about his gun-running operation gone," Timber said grimly. "But we'll be joining it if we don't move now." They had perhaps 2 minutes before the cabin became a death trap. Outside, Valdez and his remaining men were repositioning themselves to cover all possible escape routes. It was a tactical nightmare: stay and burn, or run and get shot. That's when Ayanna heard something that changed everything. From somewhere up the mountain, echoing off the peaks like the voice of the wilderness itself, came the sound of a hunting horn. 3 long blasts, followed by 3 short ones. Signal. Cherokee hunters used to call for help when facing dangerous game. Timber looked at her in confusion. "What is that?" Ayanna felt hope surge through her chest for the first time since the shooting started. "My uncle, running bear, and his hunting party. They must have seen the smoke." The sound of the horn was answered by similar calls from different directions, creating an echo that suggested multiple groups converging on their location. Valdez's men began looking around nervously, realizing that their tactical advantage was about to disappear. "How many?" Timber asked. "Enough," Ayana said with grim satisfaction. "Uncle Running Bear never hunts alone, and he never leaves family in danger." Through the smoke and chaos, she could hear Valdez screaming orders at his men. But his voice carried a note of panic now. He'd planned for a quick execution, not a running battle against unknown numbers of Cherokee warriors in their home territory. The first arrow appeared so suddenly that one of Valdez's men didn't even cry out. He simply toppled forward with a Cherokee hunting shaft buried between his shoulder blades. The second arrow followed immediately, and then the forest came alive, with war cries that had once struck terror into the hearts of cavalry units across the frontier. Running Bear and his warriors emerged from the timber like ghosts made solid, moving with the fluid precision of men who'd hunted these mountains for generations. They wore traditional buckskin and war paint, carried both ancient weapons and modern rifles, and fought with the coordinated efficiency of a pack of wolves. Valdez's remaining men broke and ran, but the Cherokee hunters were faster and knew the terrain better. The sound of gunfire and war cries echoed through the valley as justice finally caught up with the men who'd brought death to a peaceful clearing. When the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped, only Valdez himself remained alive, wounded, disarmed, and surrounded by warriors who'd heard the story of what he'd done to their kinswoman's husband. Running Bear stood over him with an ancient tomahawk in his hand, his weathered face showing no mercy for the man who'd brought such pain to his family. Ayana emerged from the burning cabin, supported by Timber, both of them blackened with smoke, but miraculously unharmed. The baby was still moving inside her, apparently as tough as its Cherokee ancestors. She looked down at Valdez, seeing fear in the eyes of the man who'd haunted her nightmares for 3 years. "You wanted to finish what you started," she said quietly, "but you forgot something important about Cherokee women." "What's that?" Valdez gasped through his pain. Ayana smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "We don't run forever. Eventually, we turn and fight." Running Bear raised his tomahawk, ready to deliver the justice that Whitelaw had failed to provide. But I held up her hand, stopping him. "No, uncle. Let him live to face trial. Let him tell the world what he did and why. Death would be too easy for him." The old warrior nodded slowly, understanding that sometimes the greatest revenge was forcing your enemy to live with the consequences of their actions. They bound Valdez's wounds and prepared to take him to town, where he would face justice for Joseph's murder and the larger web of corruption he'd built that as they prepared to leave the clearing. Ayana looked back at the smoldering remains of the cabin that had sheltered her. Everything was gone: the careful craftsmanship, the peaceful domesticity, the sanctuary Timber had built from his grief. "I'm sorry," she told him. "You lost everything because of me." Timber followed her gaze to the ruins, then looked at her, with something approaching peace in his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I found something worth saving." The words carried promise of futures neither of them had dared imagine, but first they had to survive the present. And as they followed the Cherokee warriors down the mountain trail, carrying their prisoner toward justice, Ayana felt her child kick strongly, as if the baby was eager to be born into a world where truth had finally triumphed over lies. The town of Cedar Falls had never seen anything like the procession that descended from the mountains 3 days after the battle at Timber's clearing. Leading the group was Running Bear, his weathered face painted with the traditional symbols of a successful hunt. riding his war pony with the dignity of a chief delivering justice to his people. Behind him came 6 Cherokee warriors, their rifles held ready and their eyes scanning for trouble. But it was the sight of their prisoners that made the townspeople stop and stare. Marcus Valdez, the man who'd terrorized the frontier for years under the protection of his army commission, rode, bound and bloody, on a packed horse, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. Beside him, equally restrained, rode the notorious bounty hunter Ezra Blackwood, captured during his attempt to flee the mountain battle, and at the rear of the procession, sharing a horse because the long journey had exhausted her pregnant body, rode Ayanna with Thomas McKenna, the man the world knew as Timber. She was 8 months pregnant now, her belly so large it made riding difficult, but her eyes burned with the fire of a woman who'd finally seen justice served. The town marshal, a nervous man named Webb who'd grown comfortable dealing with drunks and petty thieves, found himself facing a situation far beyond his experience. Standing on the porch of his small jail, watching this mixed party of Cherokee warriors and white fugitives approach, he felt like a mouse confronting a pack of wolves. "Marshal," Webb, running bare, said in perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to respect. "We bring you criminals. White man's criminals, for white man's justice." Webb swallowed hard, his hand hovering near his gun but not quite daring to draw it. "Now, see here, you can't just—" "We can," Ayanna interrupted, dismounting carefully. "With Timber's help. And we will. These men are wanted for murder, conspiracy, and treason against the United States Army. The territorial government will want to see them hang." The marshal's eyes widened as he recognized her. "You're that Cherokee woman, the one who was wanted for killing her husband. But I heard you were cleared." "I was cleared because the real killer confessed," Ayanna said, pointing at Valdez. "But the confession was incomplete. Marcus Valdez is the man who actually murdered Joseph Thornburst, and he's been running an illegal arms operation for years, selling weapons to hostile tribes while wearing a United States Army uniform. Valdez, despite his injuries and restraints, managed to lift his head and sneer. You have no proof of any of that. The word of a Cherokee squaw and a deserter won't stand up in any court." The casual racism in his words hit the gathering like a slap. Several of the Cherokee warriors shifted restlessly, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Running Bear held up a hand to keep them calm. "Proof," Timber said quietly, "is something we discussed during our 3-day journey down the mountain, while you were unconscious from your wounds, Mr. Valdez. Your associate, Mr. Blackwood, became quite talkative about your business arrangements." Blackwood's face went pale. "I never said nothing about you said plenty," Timber continued. "About the weapon shipments, the bribes to army quartermasters, the attacks on civilian settlements designed to justify increased military spending. You were very thorough in your confessions." The town was gathering now, drawn by the spectacle of Cherokee warriors in war paint delivering prisoners to the white man's jail. Word was spreading quickly through the streets. The infamous Ayanna Thornburst was back, no longer a fugitive, but a woman seeking justice for her murdered husband. Among the crowd, Ayanna spotted several faces she recognized from her previous life. There was Mrs. Henderson, who'd run the general store where Ayanna had bought supplies for her ranch. There was Dr. Matthews, who'd delivered medicines to Joseph when he'd been wounded during a scouting mission. And there, trying to hide at the back of the gathering, was Judge Cornelius Pike, the man who'd signed the warrant for her arrest 3 months ago. "Judge Pike," Ayanna called out, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I believe you have." some questions to answer as well. The judge's face went white as fresh snow. He'd been hoping to avoid this confrontation, but there was nowhere to run with the entire town watching. Mrs. Thornbird, I simply followed the evidence as it was presented. To me, if there were irregularities, there were bribes, Timber said bluntly. Valdez paid you to issue that warrant without a proper investigation. He needed Ayanna declared a fugitive to justify hunting her down. Judge Pike began backing away, but found his path blocked by curious townspeople who were now looking at him with suspicion and growing anger. The corruption that had poisoned their community was finally being exposed, and they wanted answers. These are serious accusations, Marshal Webb said, trying to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his authority. If what you're saying is true, we'll need federal investigators, territorial officials. What we need, said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, is to hear the full truth. Everyone turned to see a man in a black suit walking toward them, his badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight. He was older than the local marshal, with grey hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him walked two other men in similar attire, all of them armed and alert. Federal Marshal Samuel Cross, the man announced. We've been investigating reports of army corruption in this territory for months. Your telegraph about the capture of Marcus Valdez brought us here immediately. Valdez's face crumpled as he realized the scope of the trap closing around him. The federal government had been tracking his operation, building a case that would reach far beyond his individual crimes. His illegal arms dealing had funded hostile raids that had cost dozens of lives and destabilized the entire frontier. Marshal Cross, Ayanna said, stepping forward despite her exhaustion. I have information about Valdez's operation that goes back years. My husband documented much of what he discovered before he was murdered. Those documents were destroyed when your ranch burned, Cross replied. But we've found other evidence. Bank records, shipping manifests, testimony from soldiers who were ordered to look the other way while weapons disappeared from army stockpiles. The federal marshal's attention turned to Judge Pike, who was now sweating profusely despite the cool mountain air. Your Honor, we'll also need to discuss certain financial irregularities in your court. It seems you've been quite prosperous for a frontier judge with a modest salary. Pike's attempt to flee was pathetic. He managed perhaps 10 steps before federal deputies had him in custody. The crowd watched in fascination as their corrupt judge was marched toward the jail alongside the other criminals, his protests of innocence falling on deaf ears. But it was Blackwood who provided the most dramatic moment of the day. As the deputies prepared to lock him up, he suddenly broke free and made a desperate grab for Marshal Webb's gun. For a hot instant, it looked like he might succeed in creating chaos that would allow him to escape. That's when Ayanna acted with the lightning reflexes her Cherokee grandmother had trained into her as a child. Despite her pregnancy, despite her exhaustion, she moved faster than anyone thought possible. Her hand closed on a heavy stone from the street, and she hurled it with deadly accuracy. The rock caught Blackwood in the temple, dropping him unconscious to the ground before he could draw the weapon. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Ayanna barely heard them. The effort of that final confrontation had drained her last reserves of strength, and she felt herself swaying on her feet. Timber caught her before she could fall, his strong arms providing the support she desperately needed. "Easy," he murmured. In her ear, "It's over now. You can rest." "The baby," Ayanna gasped, feeling a sharp pain shoot through her abdomen. "Something's wrong." Dr. Matthews pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already in hand. One look at Ayana's pale face and labored breathing told him everything he needed to know. She's going into labor. The stress and exertion have triggered premature delivery. The crowd parted as Timber carried Ayana toward the doctor's office, but she stopped him with a weak hand on his chest. "Wait," she said, looking back at the prisoners being led into the jail. "I want to see Valdez one more time." Timber hesitated, but the look in her eyes convinced him to carry her closer to the man who'd destroyed her life. Valdez looked up at her approach, his face twisted with pain and hate. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "You think justice matters out here? There are a dozen men like me, and when they hear what happened, they'll come for you. Your child will never be safe." Ayana stared down at him for a long moment, then smiled with calm certainty. "No," she said quietly. "They won't come, because they're cowards, just like you. They prey on the weak and isolated, but I'm not alone anymore. I have family who will protect me, and I have... She looked up at Timber. "I have someone who understands what it means to build something worth defending." The contraction that hit her then was strong enough to make her cry out, and Timber immediately resumed carrying her toward medical help. But as they walked away, Ayana heard Valdez calling after them, his voice breaking with the realization that his reign of terror was truly over. "You'll regret this," he screamed. "All of you will regret this." "The only thing I regret," Ayana called back without turning around, "is that it took so long for you to face justice." Dr. Matthews' office was small but clean, equipped with the basic tools needed to handle frontier medical emergencies. As Timber laid Ayana on the examination table, the doctor was already rolling up his sleeves and preparing for what could be a difficult delivery. "How far along is she?" he asked Timber. 8 months, maybe a little more. The baby should be developed enough to survive, but premature births are always risky. I'll need someone to assist me." The doctor looked at Timber with serious eyes. "Are you the father?" "No," Timber replied without hesitation. "But I'm the man who's going to raise this child." The simple declaration carried more weight than any formal vow. Ayana felt tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but from overwhelming gratitude. After months of facing the world alone, carrying the burden of pregnancy and persecution by herself, she finally had someone willing to share the responsibility. "Then you'll do," Dr. Matthews said practically. "Wash your hands and prepare to help bring new life into the world." The labor was long and difficult, complicated by exhaustion and the stress she'd endured over the past months. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the town dealing with the aftermath of the day's revelations, federal marshals interviewing witnesses, crowds discussing the corruption that had been exposed, the general chaos of a community coming to terms with how badly they'd been deceived. But inside the doctor's office, the only sounds that mattered were Ayana's labored breathing and the quiet encouragement of the 2 men helping her through the most difficult challenge of her life. Running Bear appeared at the window as the sun was setting, his painted face showing concern for his niece. Dr. Matthews allowed him inside, recognizing that Cherokee women traditionally gave birth surrounded by family. "The spirits are with you," the old warrior told Ayana in their native language. "Your child will be strong, born from struggle but destined for peace." As if responding to his grandfather's voice, the baby chose that moment to make his final push into the world. With one last tremendous effort from Ayana and expert assistance from Dr. Matthews, her son was born small but perfectly formed, with strong lungs that announced his arrival to everyone within hearing distance. "He's beautiful," Timber said, softly, cradling the infant, while Dr. Matthews tended to Ayanna. Perfect in every way. Ayanna reached for her son with trembling hands, feeling a love so overwhelming it threatened to break her heart. After everything she'd endured, after all the loss and fear and uncertainty, she was finally holding the future in her arms. "What will you name him?" Running Bear asked. Ayanna looked at the baby, then at Timber, then at her uncle who'd risked everything to help her find justice. "Joseph," she said finally. Joseph Running Bear McKenna. The name honored her dead husband, her Cherokee heritage, and the man who'd chosen to become her family. It was a name that bridged worlds, just as this child would half Cherokee, half white. Raised by a mother who'd survived persecution and a father who'd chosen love over solitude. Outside, night was falling on Cedar Falls, but inside, Dr. Matthews' office a new day was beginning. Valdez and his accomplices were locked away, awaiting trial. The corruption that had poisoned the territory was being exposed and rooted out. And a family was being born from the ashes of tragedy, proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from choosing to build something beautiful in spite of them. As Ayanna held her son close, feeling Timber's protective presence beside her and seeing her uncle's proud smile, she knew that the worst was finally behind them. The future stretched ahead like an uncharted trail, full of possibilities and promise, and for the first time since Joseph's death, she was eager to discover where that trail would lead. The winter of 1875 came early to the Oregon mountains, but inside the temporary cabin that Timber and Running Bear had built together, warmth radiated from more than just the stone fireplace. 3 months had passed since little Joseph's dramatic birth in Dr. Matthews' office, and the baby had grown, strong despite his premature arrival. His Cherokee features were already evident in his dark eyes and the way he gripped his mother's finger with surprising strength. But there was something of Timber in his determined expression when he wanted something. Ayanna sat in the rocking chair that Timber had carved for her during the long nights of late pregnancy, nursing her son while watching the two most important men in her life work on plans for their permanent home. The original cabin had been destroyed in the battle with Valdez, but its loss had given them an opportunity to build something better, a house that would accommodate their growing family and honor both Cherokee traditions and frontier practicality. The main room should face east, Running Bear said, sketching on a piece of bark with charcoal. Cherokee homes always greet the morning sun. It brings good fortune to children born under the roof. Timber nodded, adding his own marks to the design. "We'll need a workshop attached to the house. I want to go back to carpentry, maybe start a furniture-making business. There's good timber on this land, and the town below is growing fast enough to need quality furniture." The conversation represented more than just construction plans. It was about building a life that honored both their cultures while creating something entirely new. Ayanna had never imagined that her uncle and the white lumberjack who'd saved her would form such a strong friendship. But the shared experience of protecting family had bonded them in ways that transcended racial boundaries. During the 3 months since Valdez's capture and the exposure of the corruption ring, the territory had begun to heal. Federal investigators had uncovered a network of illegal activity that stretched from army quartermasters to territorial judges, resulting in dozens of arrests and court-martials. The stolen weapons that had fueled years of frontier violence had been traced and recovered. Most importantly, the systematic persecution of Cherokee families like Ayanna's had been exposed and stopped. But healing wasn't just happening at the territorial level. It was occurring in Cedar Falls itself. the town had been forced to confront its own prejudices when they learned how badly they'd misjudged Ayana. The woman they'd branded a murderer and fugitive had turned out to be the victim of a conspiracy that had cost innocent lives across the frontier. Shame was a powerful teacher, and the community was learning hard lessons about the difference between justice and prejudice. "There's something we need to discuss," Timber said, setting down his charcoal and looking at both Ayana and Running Bear with serious eyes. "The federal marshal came by yesterday while you were visiting Mrs. Henderson in town. They want me to testify at Valdez's trial." Ayana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind outside. "What kind of testimony?" "Everything I know about his operations during the Indian Wars. Names, dates, specific weapons, shipments. They're building a case that could result in treason charges, which means—" Timber paused, clearly struggling with the implications. "Which means they want me to admit to things I did while serving under him." The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. During his years as Thomas McKenna, Timber had followed orders that he later learned were part of Valdez's illegal operation. He'd helped transport weapons that were supposed to go to legitimate army units but had instead been sold to hostile tribes. At the time, he'd been a loyal soldier following what appeared to be legitimate commands. But ignorance wasn't always a defense in military court. "What could happen to you?" Ayana asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Court-martial, possibly. Reduction in rank, loss of pension, maybe prison time if they decide I was a willing participant rather than a dupe." Timber's expression was calm, but Ayana could see the fear in his eyes. "The irony is that the only way to ensure Valdez gets the punishment he deserves is for me to risk my own freedom." Running Bear had been listening carefully, his weathered face thoughtful. "In Cherokee law," he said slowly, "a man who unknowingly helps evil is not judged the same as one who chooses evil. But white law is different. White law often punishes the weapon instead of the hand that wields it." "I have to testify," Timber said firmly. "Too many people died because of Valdez's operation. If my testimony can prevent other families from going through what you experienced, what I experienced, then it's worth the risk." Ayana felt her heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, someone who would sacrifice his own safety to ensure justice for others. But it was also the father her son desperately needed, and the thought of losing him to military justice was almost unbearable. "Then we'll face it together," she said, surprising both men with the steel in her voice. "I'll testify too, about Joseph's murder, about the conspiracy to frame me, about everything Valdez did to destroy innocent lives. If they want the full truth, they'll get it." The baby stirred in her arms, as if sensing the tension in the room. Little Joseph had been born into a world of conflict, but he'd also been born into a family that understood the importance of standing up for what was right. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would learn from their example. Over the following weeks, as winter tightened its grip on the mountains, the three adults worked together to prepare for the upcoming trial while continuing to plan their future. Timber spent hours each day writing detailed accounts of his military service, trying to separate legitimate orders from the illegal activities he'd unknowingly participated in. Ayana organized the scattered evidence of Joseph's investigation into army corruption, piecing together a timeline that showed how long Valdez had been operating his illegal network. Meanwhile, Running Bear worked on something entirely different: formal petition to the Cherokee Nation's governing council. asking them to recognize Timber as a member of their community through adoption. It was an unusual request, but the old warrior argued that a man who'd risked his life to protect Cherokee family deserved Cherokee protection in return. The white courts may try to punish him for following orders. Running Bear explained to Ayanna as they worked together preparing winter preserves. But if he is Cherokee through adoption, he can claim trial under tribal law for any actions that took place on Cherokee land. It was a clever legal strategy, but more than that, it was a recognition of bonds that went deeper than blood. Timber had chosen to be part of their family, and now that family was choosing him in return. The letter from the territorial capital arrived on a bitter December morning, brought by a male rider who looked half frozen from his journey through the mountain passes. Timber opened it with hands that were steadier than Ayanna felt, reading the official summons that would determine their future. "The trial starts in 2 weeks," he said quietly. "Federal court in Portland. They want both of us, they're me, as a witness for the prosecution, you as a victim testifying about Valdez's crimes." Ayanna looked down at her 3-month-old son, sleeping peacefully in his cradle. The thought of traveling to Portland in winter with an infant was daunting. But the thought of facing this trial without Timber's testimony was worse. "We'll make it work," she said. Mrs. Henderson offered to care for Joseph if needed, and Dr. Matthews said the baby is strong enough for travel if we keep him warm. But it was Running Bear who provided the best solution. "I will come with you," he announced. "Not just to Portland, but to testify myself. Valdez's weapons killed Cherokee warriors during the last raids. If white law wants to punish him properly, they need to hear from the families of his victims." The journey to Portland took 5 days through some of the worst winter weather the territory had seen in years. They traveled in a covered wagon that Timber had specially modified with extra insulation and a small stove, creating a mobile home that could protect them from the elements. Little Joseph proved to be a remarkably good traveler, sleeping through most of the jolting ride and charming everyone. They met at the way stations where they stopped each night. Portland in 1875 was a booming city, growing rich from lumber and shipping, but it was also a place where racial tensions ran high and justice was often influenced by politics rather than truth. The federal courthouse was an imposing stone building that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inspire confidence. And Ayanna felt her stomach tighten as they climbed the steps for the first day of testimony. The courtroom was packed with spectators, newspaper reporters, and military officials who'd come to see how the army would handle one of the biggest corruption scandals in frontier history. Valdez sat at the defendant's table, his scarred face showing no remorse, flanked by lawyers who'd been hired by interests that preferred to keep certain details hidden. But it was the prosecution team that surprised Ayanna most, led by a young federal attorney named Catherine Wells, one of the first women lawyers in the territory. They seemed genuinely committed to exposing the full scope of Valdez's crimes, regardless of how many powerful people might be embarrassed in the process. "Mrs. McKenna," Attorney Wells said when Ayanna took the stand, "please tell the court about the night your first husband was murdered." The formal use of her new name sent a thrill through Ayanna's chest. She and Timber had married quietly in a Cherokee ceremony performed by Running Bear just before leaving for Portland. But this was the first time their union had been recognized in white society. It was a small victory, but meaningful. Ayanna's testimony was devastating in its detail. She described Joseph's growing suspicions about army weapons being diverted to hostile tribes, his careful documentation of irregular shipments, his fear that confronting his superior officers would result in retaliation. She told the court about the night he was murdered, about waking to find their ranch house on fire, about the systematic campaign to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. When Valdez's lawyers tried to attack her credibility by emphasizing her Cherokee heritage, Attorney Wells objected so forcefully that the judge threatened to hold the defense in contempt. "Your Honor," Wells said, "this woman's race has no bearing on her truthfulness. What matters is that she was the victim of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government, and she deserves justice regardless of the color of her skin." Timber's testimony was even more damaging to Valdez's case. His detailed knowledge of military procedures, combined with his honest admission of his own unwitting participation in illegal activities, painted a picture of systematic corruption that shocked even the experienced military officers serving as court advisors. "I followed orders," Timber said when Valdez's lawyer tried to paint him as a co-conspirator. "I trusted my commanding officer to be honest about the purpose of our missions. When I learned the truth about what we'd been doing, I left the army and tried to build a life away from that corruption." "And yet you killed 4 men in California," the defense attorney pressed. "Men you claimed were responsible for your family's death. How do we know you're not a killer seeking revenge against my client as well?" Timber looked directly at Valdez as he answered, "Because if I wanted revenge, Marcus Valdez would already be dead. What I want now is justice, not just for my family, but for all the families his crimes have destroyed." But it was Running Bear's testimony that provided the most powerful moment of the entire trial. Speaking through an interpreter, but occasionally breaking into perfect English when emotion overwhelmed him, the old Cherokee warrior described the impact of Valdez's weapons on his people. "These guns killed my nephew," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "They killed women and children during raids that would never have happened if warriors had not been armed with stolen army weapons. This man," he pointed directly at Valdez, "has blood of Cherokee families on his hands. In my law, in any good law, he should hang." The courtroom was completely silent as Running Bear's words sank in. Here was a man whose people had suffered centuries of injustice at the hands of white authority, calling for that same authority to deliver justice against one of its own. The moral weight of his testimony was undeniable. When the prosecution rested its case, Ayanna felt cautiously optimistic. They'd presented overwhelming evidence of Valdez's guilt, established clear patterns of corruption, and demonstrated the human cost of his crimes. But she also knew that frontier justice was unpredictable, especially when it involved charges against a white man based largely on testimony from Cherokee witnesses. The defense's case was predictably weak. They focused on technicalities and tried to shift blame to subordinates who'd been following orders. But they couldn't explain away the bank records, the shipping manifests, or the testimony of multiple witnesses who'd seen Valdez personally negotiate illegal weapon sales. When the jury returned after 3 hours of deliberation, their verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts, including treason. The judge sentenced Valdez to hang, with the execution scheduled for the following month. As the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, Ayanna felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for almost a year. Justice had finally been served, not just for Joseph, but for all the innocent people who'd suffered because of one man's greed and ambition. But the trial's end brought an unexpected complication. Attorney Wells approached them as they prepared to leave the courthouse, her expression serious. "Mr. McKenna," she said, The army has decided not to pursue charges against you for your unwitting participation in Valdez's operation. However, they're offering you something else: reinstatement at your former rank, with full back pay and the opportunity to help reform military procurement procedures. Timber looked at Ayana, then at Running Bear, then at the baby sleeping in his wife's arms. "Thank you," he said finally. "But I have a different kind of service in mind now. I'm going home to build furniture and raise my son." As they walked out of the courthouse into the winter sunlight, Ayana felt truly free for the first time since Joseph's death. The past had been resolved, justice had been served, and the future stretched ahead full of promise. Behind them, Marcus Valdez was led away in chains to await his appointment with the hangman's noose. His reign of terror was finally over, and the families he'd destroyed could begin to heal. But ahead of them lay something even more important: new life built on the foundation of love, justice, and the kind of courage that turns survivors into builders of better worlds. 5 years had transformed the mountain clearing from a place of violence into something that resembled paradise. Where Timber's original cabin had burned in the battle with Valdez, now stood a magnificent house that blended Cherokee architectural traditions with frontier craftsmanship. The main structure faced east to greet the morning sun, just as Running Bear had insisted, while a spacious workshop attached to the south side housed the furniture-making business that had made the McKenna name famous throughout the Oregon Territory. Ayana stood on the covered porch, watching her son Joseph play in the garden with his younger sister, Mary Sarah, named for both Timber's first wife and Ayana's grandmother. At 5 years old, Joseph showed the serious concentration of his Cherokee ancestors when tracking rabbits through the vegetable rows, while 3-year-old Mary Sarah possessed her father's patient determination as she tried to stack blocks higher than her head. The sound of an approaching wagon made Ayana look up from her children's play. Dr. Matthews was climbing the mountain road with his monthly supply delivery, but today he wasn't alone. Beside him, on the wagon seat, sat a young Cherokee woman, perhaps 17 years old, with the kind of haunted eyes that Ayana remembered seeing in her own mirror during the darkest days of her persecution. "Mrs. McKenna," Dr. Matthews called, as he brought the wagon to a stop. "I've brought someone who needs your help. This is Dawn Walker. She's been accused of stealing from the general store in Cedar Falls. But I think there's more to the story than anyone wants to admit." Came down the porch steps, immediately recognizing the signs of a young woman who'd been failed by the justice system. Dawn Walker's clothes were torn and dirty. Her wrists bore the marks of recently removed shackles, and she held herself with the defensive posture of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from every encounter. "What kind of help does she need?" Ayana asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The kind you needed 5 years ago," Dr. Matthews replied quietly. "A place to tell her story to people who might actually listen." Before Ayana could respond, Timber emerged from his workshop, drawn by the sound of voices. His carpenter's apron was covered with wood shavings, and his hands bore the honest stains of a man who built beautiful things for a living. But it was the way he immediately assessed the situation and moved to support his wife that showed how completely he'd embraced his role as protector of those who needed sanctuary. "Dawn Walker," Ayana said gently, "would you like to come inside and tell us what happened?" The story that emerged over the next hour was painfully familiar. Dawn had been working as a seamstress in Cedar Falls, saving money to help her family during a particularly harsh winter, when several expensive items disappeared from the general store where she occasionally helped with inventory. She was immediately suspected, despite having no history of theft. The store owner, a man named Peterson who'd never liked having Cherokee. Workers in his establishment had been quick to involve the sheriff rather than investigate other possibilities. "I never took nothing," Dawn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't steal. My grandmother taught me that stealing poisons the spirit of the one who takes and the one who loses." Ayanna exchanged a meaningful look with Timber. They'd both learned that accusations against Cherokee people in frontier towns were often based more on prejudice than evidence, and that the legal system was rarely interested in protecting indigenous rights. "Where is your family now?" Timber asked. Dead Dawn replied flatly. "Fever took them last winter. I'm alone." The words hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Here was another young Cherokee woman, alone and defenseless, facing a justice system that had already decided her guilt based on her race rather than facts. It was her own story all over again, but with a crucial difference this time. Ayanna was in a position to help. "You're not alone anymore," Ayanna said firmly. "You can stay here as long as you need, and we'll make sure you get a fair hearing." Over the following days, Timber and Ayanna worked together to investigate Dawn's case with the same methodical approach they'd learnt during their own legal battles. Timber used his reputation as a respected businessman to ask pointed questions about the store's security and inventory procedures, while Ayanna spoke with other Cherokee workers who'd experienced Peterson's hostility. What they discovered was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple prejudice. Peterson had been systematically cheating his Cherokee employees, paying them less than promised, charging inflated prices for goods, and keeping deliberately poor records that made it easy to blame losses on theft rather than his own mismanagement. "He's been running this scam for years," Timber explained to Federal Marshal Cross, who'd traveled from Portland specifically to investigate their claims. "Dawn Walker is just the latest victim, but she's also the one who can expose the whole operation." The Marshal's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Peterson had been collaborating with corrupt local officials to arrest Cherokee workers on false charges, then seized their savings as evidence in theft cases that never went to trial. It was a sophisticated scheme that had stolen hundreds of dollars from some of the territory's most vulnerable residents. When Peterson was finally arrested, Dawn Walker was not only cleared of all charges, but also offered compensation for the wages and savings that had been stolen from her. More importantly, the investigation led to reforms in how Cherokee workers were treated throughout the territory, establishing legal protections that would help prevent future exploitation. But Dawn's case was just one example of the work that had come to define the McKenna household. Word had spread throughout the Cherokee communities that Ayanna and Timber's mountain home was a place where justice could be found when the regular legal system failed. They'd helped reunite families separated by fraudulent adoptions, recovered stolen land through careful research of property records, and provided sanctuary for women fleeing abusive marriages. "We've become what I never thought possible," I told Running Bear as they sat on the porch one evening, watching their extended family of temporary refugees and permanent residents share dinner together. "We've become a bridge between two worlds that usually see each other as enemies." Running Bear, now in his 70s but still sharp as his hunting knife, nodded thoughtfully. "That was always your gift, niece. Even as a child, you could see the good in people regardless of what tribe they came from. Joseph Thornbird saw it too. That's why he chose you as his wife. And Timber sees it," Ayanna added, watching her husband teach young Joseph how to properly hold a carving knife. "That's what makes this work. He doesn't try to become Cherokee, and I don't try to become white. We just try to become better people together." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor, Catherine Wells, the attorney who'd prosecuted Valdez's case 5 years earlier. She was older now, her hair touched with grey, but her eyes still burned with the passion for justice that had made her such an effective advocate. Mrs. McKenna Wells said as she dismounted from her horse, "I have a proposition that I think will interest you." What Wells proposed was revolutionary for its time, a legal aid society specifically designed to help Cherokee and other indigenous people navigate the white legal system. Ayanna would serve as a cultural liaison and investigator, using her knowledge of both communities to identify cases where justice was being denied. Timber would provide logistical support and use his business connections to fund the organization. The territorial government is finally ready to acknowledge that the current system isn't working, Wells explained. Your success in cases like Dawn Walker's has convinced them that reform is not only morally necessary, but politically advantageous. It was an opportunity to institutionalize the work they'd been doing informally, to create lasting change that would outlive their individual efforts. But it was also a chance to honor the memory of Joseph Thornbird, whose death had started Ayanna on the path toward becoming an advocate for justice. "We'll do it," Ayanna said, not needing to consult with Timber because she already knew what his answer would be. "But we do it our way, with Cherokee law given equal weight with federal law, and with respect for traditional methods of conflict resolution." Wells smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less from the woman who survived what you survived and came out stronger as summer turned to autumn in that 5th year after Valdez's execution. The McKenna Legal Aid Society held its first formal case review. Representatives from Cherokee communities throughout the territory gathered at the Mountain House to discuss ongoing legal issues and coordinate responses to systemic discrimination. But it was during the evening celebration, as traditional drums echoed off the mountain peaks and Cherokee singers shared ancient songs with white allies, that Ayanna felt the full weight of what they'd accomplished. Here, in the place where she'd once fled as a desperate fugitive, people of different races and cultures were working together toward justice. Little Joseph, now 5 and full of questions about everything, tugged on his mother's dress as the celebration continued around them. "Mama," he said in the serious tone he used for important questions, "why do some people try to hurt other people?" Ayanna knelt down to meet her son's eyes, seeing in them the innocence she'd once thought the world would steal from any child born into frontier violence. "Some people are afraid," she said simply. "They're afraid of losing what they have, so they try to take from others. But fear makes people do terrible things." "What makes people do good things?" Joseph asked. Ayanna looked around at the gathering Cherokee elders sharing stories with white settlers, former enemies working together to build a more just society. Her husband teaching carpentry skills to young men regardless of their heritage. "Love," she said finally. "Love makes people brave enough to do good things, even when it's hard." As the evening wound down and their guests prepared to return to their own communities, Dawn Walker approached Ayanna with something approaching shyness. In the 2 months she'd been living with the McKenna family, she'd grown from a frightened refugee into a confident young woman with her own dreams of becoming a teacher. "Mrs. McKenna," Dawn said, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. But more than that, I wanted to ask if you'd teach me how to do what you do, how to help people who don't have anyone else to turn to." Ayanna felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Here was the true measure of their success, not just in solving individual cases, but in inspiring others to continue the work of building a more just world. "I'll teach you everything I know," Ayana promised. But the most important lesson is one you've already learned, that everyone deserves someone willing to fight for them. Later that night, as Ayana and Timber sat on their porch listening to the night sounds of the mountain forest, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place. 5 years earlier, she'd been a pregnant fugitive running for her life, and he'd been a lonely man consumed by grief and guilt. Now they were partners in both life and purpose, raising children who would grow up believing that justice was possible and that love was stronger than hate. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never met? Ayana asked, leaning against Timber's shoulder as they watched stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Every day, Timber replied, his arm tightening around her. And every day, I'm grateful that we don't have to find out. In the distance, a wolf howled not, the lonely sound of a solitary hunter, but the rich harmony of a pack calling to each other across the wilderness. It was a sound that spoke of family, of belonging, of creatures who'd learned that survival meant working together rather than fighting alone. And in that sound, Ayana heard the echo of her own transformation from hunted to hunter, from victim to victor, from a woman running from the past to one building a better future. The little girl who'd once listened to her grandmother's stories about Cherokee warriors had become a warrior herself, fighting battles with law books and witness testimony rather than bows and arrows. As they prepared to go inside, Ayana took one last look at the clearing where their story had begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people in need of help, new opportunities to choose justice over convenience. But tonight, surrounded by the family they'd chosen and the community they'd built, she was content to simply be grateful for the long, strange journey that had brought them home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.